Well, joining me now to discuss Budget 2018 are Soria Hay, who's the Head of Corporate Finance at Bravura, Ettiene Retief, Chairperson of the SARS Committee at the South African Institute of Professional Accountants, and from our Cape Town studios, Kenosi Mahosha, who's an actuary at Sanlam. People, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this evening. Kenosi, perhaps let me start with you. I mean, this was always going to be a very difficult budget because on the one hand, you needed to be prudent, doing the least amount of damage you possibly can on the ground. Do you think this budget achieved that balance?
I think the minister really took a lot of thinking with this budget because he had to really make some tough decisions in terms of just getting the finances back in order. But then with having to get the public behind him, even though they were going to be adversely affected by what he had to deliver. So he took a step forward in the right direction.
Now, having said that, Ettiene, let me bring you here in. I mean, you still have a situation where low-income earners, in particular, will feel that pinch of VAT. They also feel the effects of a fuel levy. I believe in totality, we're looking at 52 cents of an increase in a litre of fuel. Would that be enough of a pinch to make them angry, you think? And I speak of the low-income earners here.
Look, I think there's going to be an immediate knock-on effect for sure to everyone, and of course the more you find challenges in making your own budget work each month, you're going to feel that pinch even more. There's obviously the offset in terms of it, that there's greater grants, there's the relief in terms of tertiary education, those to justify it. But I think the reality is that we couldn't really up it at the top scale position. We've already seen the evidence has shown that we've gotten to that what was referred to as the Laffer curve over time now. As we at that point where last year's increase actually didn't yield the kind of numbers in return and revenue collection as what we expected. So it already indicates that any further increase at that level really wasn't going to yield further result. So we have to broaden it to a broader tax base rather than a smaller tax base. Yeah,
interesting comment about the curve. Soria, let me bring you in here. I mean, in many instances, that's exactly what it's all about. You want to increase taxes to such an extent, or you want to avoid rather increasing those taxes to such an extent that it actually keeps people away from paying taxes. Do you think he has successfully achieved that?
I think what he has achieved successfully is a holding pattern, which was very important from a stabilization perspective and the rating agents. They are going to watch us very carefully over the next couple of months, and if over this period we can increase our tax collection, broaden the net, grow the country, then I think those will be the right things that will allow us not to be downgraded, which obviously would be a very bad outcome for us. So from that perspective, I think it was a successful budget for the country. I think it is tough on everybody in the country, especially for the poorer people as well.
I want to get to the issue of ratings in a moment here, but Ettiene, let me just swing this back to you. I mean, if we had to choose a bracket that possibly were the biggest losers as far as tax is concerned, the money has to come from somewhere. So is there a loser on the tax front?
I think generally yes, because what we have is there's typically the whole drag concept that we implement. So although we didn't increase the taxes at the top bracket, maybe we also didn't adjust it for inflationary value. Yes. So at the lower scale, although we've not fully adjusted for inflation, so there's still not a full compensation, there's still partial compensation. So effectively, the person at the top end of the scale is in rand terms going to be paying more in taxes, even though as a percentage not more, but in rand value will pay more. And even with that, yes, we're saying that typically it's a regressive tax, and yes, it does affect everyone, including the poor, but let's not forget that effectively the more you spend, the greater that impact in a rand value is. So effectively the wealthier and the consumer, as their appetite changes and they spend more, what happens is their contribution from a rand perspective is far greater to the fiscal collection than as pure percentage values.
Yeah, and in totality, you're looking at about 36 billion rand recovered on the revenue front. And at the same time, Kenosi, you have government or the Treasury and the Finance Minister telling us that there was 85 billion rand in a cutting of expenditure or government spending. I would think that all he did with the 85 billion was reprioritize rather than spending. I suppose that most of that money would actually go towards that big elephant in the room, student fees for university students. Do you think the right sort of approach was done there in cutting that spending?
Well, the minister actually had to cut spending to actually help manage the deficit that was arising for the government. So it was a bit of a trade-off he had to call. Obviously, there was a promise made to lower income households that there will be free education. So with that redirection of spending to free education, at least you are creating equipped, skilled workforce, people who can actually participate better in the economy. So it's although there's a cut, it helps to rebalance where we are better positioning the economy for growth through skilled workforce.
Soria, you were talking earlier about ratings agencies, and let's just try and look at the numbers, the fundamentals here. We've got growth still hovering around 1% for 2017. He sees that number rising to 1.5% this year. We still have an uncomfortable budget deficit, don't we? 4.3%. And then the debt levels, gross debt reaching 56%, growing by 2020. How is that viewed by a ratings agency? I mean, the fundamentals don't look too encouraging, do they?
So I think Moody's wanted to see a couple of things happening in the country, of which the budget and fiscal discipline was just one. I think the events over the last 2 months have already been positive. Hopefully that will buy us some time so that Moody's do not downgrade us. So from that perspective, I think the minister may have done enough. And I think, and I just want to bring a complete different matter in here, if what the minister wants to do is to get SARS back to a proper efficiency, he made some allowance in the budget. If we think about it, a 1% more efficient collection makes a 15 billion difference to the budget, 2% 30 and so forth. So I think they are relatively conservative now when they talk about growth. I think we can do a little bit better, and I think our revenue collection can also do a little bit better. So from that perspective, I think it was solid and robust as opposed to over-promising, and the rating agent will see that.
There was one figure, Ettiene, that caught my eye. You look at those debt service costs in the previous year. They were sitting around 162 billion. Come this budget, that figure rising to 180 billion. It's the fastest growing part of our budget. It can get scary, can it not?
True. And I think this is where, if anything, I think the budget, I would say any negative, is that when you're looking at a budget, your revenue you can only change to a certain extent. Economic outlook is a key component, and how much tax I can collect from that. But on the other side is, how do I spend that? So whatever I'm short, I have to borrow. And in all honesty, there's nothing wrong with borrowing if that money goes to reprioritizing to, let's say, infrastructure spend that is necessary to grow the economy. But if we're borrowing in order to pay for our current costs and to service further debt, then we're putting ourselves into a very, very awkward circumstance. And that's what we should be concerned with. So in this year, I didn't see that enough had gone into that infrastructure spend to justify the increase in essentially our debt servicing. And that's where it's a little bit concerning. But saying that is that the problem is that where would we have cut expenditure? So yes, we could have cut it, but there were promises made, such as the education, and let's not forget that economic growth is a key component to increasing, for instance, employment rate and these things that will basically bring us back to a larger tax net.
Yeah. Kenosi, I want to end with you very quickly. Just at the end or the close of business today, we saw markets 1.1% up the JSE All Share. We saw the Rand gaining about 10 cents since the start of the speech to the end. So you're just looking at it on a broad level there from that reaction, one would think this budget was welcomed by the sort of investor front or the business front. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I agree with that sentiment that the market received the budget well, as tough as it was. The challenge will obviously be in how it gets implemented, but the market received it well, and I think it's also good for companies in terms of renewed hope and confidence, which also helps people at large in the economy in terms of the prosperity and the prospects they will have in the economy.
All right, we'll leave it there. Kenosi Mahosha, actuary at Sanlam, joining us from Cape Town. Thank you very much for joining us. Soria Hay, Head of Corporate Finance at Bravura, and Ettiene Retief, Chairman of SARS Committee at SAIPA. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us this evening.